Black judge humiliated by police in a restaurant. But their regret came quickly, and the turnaround was surprising. Malcolm Richardson entered the upscale restaurant in Kensington with a sense of determination and expectation. The day at the courthouse had been exhausting, filled with long hours of hearings, but now he just wanted to relax and enjoy a quiet meal. As he crossed the glass door, a soft bell announced his arrival, but what should have been a warm welcome quickly turned into an awk. The eyes of the patrons turned toward him, some with expressions of surprise, others with a mix of disdain and suspicion. Malcolm felt a chill in his stomach, a discomfort that seemed to intensify with every step. He made his way to the back of the dining room, where a well-positioned table offered a view of the restaurant's elegant decor. As he sat down, the murmurs that had previously filled the air among the diners transformed into audible whispers. "What is he doing here? Did you see what he's wearing?" The words intertwined in the atmosphere, forming an invisible web of prejudices that surrounded him. Malcolm ignored the comments, trying to focus on the menu, but the oppressive environment was becoming hard to bear. Across the room, Sophie Mitchell, the restaurant manager, observed the scene. She was a middle-aged woman with neatly styled hair and a look that reflected the tension of the moment. Sophie knew something was wrong, but she hesitated to intervene. "Should I do something?" she thought, glancing at Malcolm, who was trying, in vain, to relax. Deep down, she struggled between the unspoken norms of the upper class and what was morally right. "If I intervene, I might lose customers," she pondered, her heart racing. Malcolm, sensing Sophie's hesitation, took a deep breath and decided he wouldn't let the situation shake him. "A glass of water, please," he asked the server who approached, trying to maintain his composure. The young waiter looked at him with a doubtful expression, as if weighing the validity of the request. "Sure, I'll bring it right away," he replied, before hurriedly walking away. Malcolm shook his head, trying to push away the frustration bubbling up inside him. He looked around, capturing the curious and hostile glances from other patrons, and decided it was time to assert himself. When the server returned with the water, Malcolm made a conscious effort to smile. "Thank you," he said, but the young man's response was merely a nod, as if relieved not to have to interact further. Malcolm then turned to the table next to him, where a group of well-dressed men were conversing loudly. "Do you think this restaurant is just for you?" he inquired, without losing his calm. The reaction was immediate. The men fell silent, but soon one of them, clad in an expensive suit, responded with disdain. "I think you're in the wrong place, buddy." The tension in the room escalated. Malcolm felt anger rising within him, but he remembered who he was. "I'm a federal judge," he said firmly, his voice resonating, "and I won't let any prejudice make me feel less than who I am." Silence fell again, but now it was a heavy silence, laden with confusion and displeasure. Sophie, who had been watching the scene unfold, could no longer remain paralyzed. She felt she needed to act, but fear of repercussions held her back. What should have been a peaceful meal had now transformed into an emotional battleground. Malcolm looked at Sophie, who finally seemed to have made a decision. But before she could approach, the atmosphere was already shifting, and he sensed that at any moment the situation could spiral out of control. Malcolm Richardson was lost in his thoughts, trying to leave the courtroom tensions behind as he settled into a table at the elegant restaurant in Kensington. The ambiance was sophisticated, with soft lighting and a murmur of lively conversations, but as he surveyed the room, a sense of discomfort crept in. Curious and suspicious glances turned toward him, as if his presence was an intrusion in a space reserved for the worthy. He took a deep breath, attempting to ignore the silence that had fallen around him, but the disdainful expressions on some faces were undeniable. The manager of the restaurant, Sophie Mitchell, watched the scene from the corner of the room, her heart racing. She was a woman in her 30s with a successful career, but at that moment her authority felt like a burden. Sophie hesitated, biting her lower lip as she contemplated the repercussions of any action she might take. "Should I intervene?" she questioned herself. The answer seemed as complex as the incident itself. The restaurant was a place where class and race norms intertwined in subtle and insidious ways. Meanwhile, James Cooper and Daniel Harris, two plainclothes police officers, were seated at a nearby table. Daniel, a younger man with a relaxed demeanor, winked at James, who appeared increasingly irritated. "Did you see the look on his face when he walked in? He looks like he doesn't belong here," James whispered, subtly pointing at Malcolm. "I think he's a judge or something," Daniel replied, trying to steer the conversation away. But James had already made up his mind. "I'm going to ask what he's doing here." The manager, realizing the officers were approaching, felt a chill run down her spine. No, this can't end well, she murmured to herself, but remained paralyzed as the men made their way to Malcolm. The two officers approached with an air of authority that was almost palpable. "Excuse me, sir. May I see your identification?" James said, his abrupt tone breaking the silence enveloping the table. Malcolm looked up, surprised and confused. "I'm sorry, but I'm a federal judge. I was just here to have dinner," he explained, his voice calm but laced with indignation. "A judge, is it? And what is a judge doing in a place like this?" James replied, a hint of contempt in his voice. James's words sounded like an accusation, and Malcolm's discomfort morphed into humiliation. He extended his hand to show his badge, but the officer's attitude was not one of seeking answers. It was combative. "You don't need to do this," Daniel intervened, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Let's just ask him to identify himself and move on." But James, stubborn in his approach, pressed on. "He doesn't look like the other customers," he commented, a sarcastic smile forming on his lips, making Malcolm feel even more isolated. The tension in the room intensified, and the gazes of the other diners became heavy, filled with curiosity and discomfort. Standing now, Malcolm tried to keep his composure. "There's no reason for this. I'm here as any other customer would be. I'm just trying to have dinner," he said, his voice steady, though indignation burned inside him. The police officers didn't hear him. James made a brusque gesture with his hand, as if dismissing an annoyance. "Come on, we don't want to cause more commotion. You need to leave." The humiliation was overwhelming as James grabbed him by the arm and began to lead him out of the restaurant. Malcolm felt Sophie's gaze, now frozen in place, unable to act as the scene unfolded before her. "This is absurd. Let me go. I have rights," Malcolm shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the growing murmurs of the patrons and the noise of the restaurant. He was dragged outside, feeling anger and helplessness blend as the environment around him grew increasingly blurry. The weight of injustice hit him with brutal force, and as the door closed behind him, a new chapter of his life was about to begin, marked by humiliation but also by a determination to fight for justice. The first hours after the incident at the restaurant were a whirlwind for Malcolm. He was at home, sitting in his favorite armchair, his eyes glued to the television screen, where the images of his embarrassment replayed like an unbearable echo. The headline that struck him the hardest was, "Judge removed from restaurant. What's happening to justice?" The irony of the title cut him to the core. The very justice he had dedicated his life to defending was now being questioned, and he had become the center of a media storm. "Malcolm, are you okay?" his wife Vanessa asked as she entered the room. She carried a tray with tea and cookies, but her expression was one of concern. "You need to take care of yourself." "I know, but I can't stop thinking about what happened. It's like everything I've built is crumbling," Malcolm replied, his voice heavy with frustration. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories of the humiliation he suffered. "People are going to see me differently now. They're going to think I'm not worthy of the position I hold." Vanessa sat down beside him, placing her hand over his. "Malcolm, you are a respected judge. This doesn't change because of a group of ignorant people. You need to use this as a platform for change." He looked at her, admiring her strength, but doubt still lingered. "What if I can't? What if this only makes the situation worse?" Meanwhile, in the living room, the TV showed a reporter discussing the repercussions of the incident. "Society is divided," the anchor said, gesturing animatedly. "Some argue that Malcolm Richardson is a victim of institutional racism, while others assert that he should have behaved differently." "See? Even they are using this against me," Malcolm murmured. "As if it's my fault." Vanessa sighed. "You know this is a distorted narrate. You can't let it get to you. The world needs to hear your voice, Malcolm." That night, after hours of empty discussions around the dinner table and attempts to find emotional balance, Malcolm decided he would not remain silent. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by papers and notes, and began drafting a statement. With each word, he felt his anger and pain transform into something powerful. Meanwhile, at the restaurant, Sophie Mitchell watched the news, her heart heavy with guilt. She had witnessed what happened, and helplessness consumed her. "I could have done something," she murmured, holding a glass of water against her chest. The image of Malcolm being dragged out of the restaurant would not leave her mind. "Why didn't I intervene?" she questioned aloud, drawing the attention of her colleague, Mark. "Sophie, you can't blame yourself for that. It wasn't your responsibility," he said, trying to comfort her. But the words were not enough. I should have protected him. The next day, as Malcolm prepared for a press conference, Sophie decided she could no longer remain silent. She put on a dark blazer and headed to the location, determined to find her voice. When she arrived, she saw journalists crowding and sensed the tension in the air. When it finally came her turn to speak, Malcolm took a deep breath, facing the cameras. What happened to me is not just a personal matter. It's a reflection of a systemic issue that affects many. Institutional racism is real and needs to be confronted. We cannot allow fear and ignorance to divide us. We must unite for justice. Sophie, hearing his words, felt a surge of determination. After the press conference ended, she approached Malcolm. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have done something that day. He looked at her and saw sincerity in her eyes. Change begins with the willingness to acknowledge our mistakes, Sophie. It's not too late to act. Sophie nodded, resolute. I want to help. I want to stand by your side and fight against this. Malcolm smiled, feeling that even amid pain and confusion there was a glimmer of hope. Together we can make a difference. The conversation left Malcolm feeling stronger, and he knew the fight was just beginning, but now he was not alone. The voices would unite, transforming pain into a clamor for justice. Malcolm sat at his office table, surrounded by piles of documents and reports. The atmosphere was tense, but he knew he needed to turn his indignation into action. His lawyers, Carla and Felipe, entered with serious expressions, reflecting the gravity of the situation. We need to act quickly, Malcolm, Carla began, pulling up a chair and leaning forward. What happened at the restaurant is not just a personal matter. It's a reflection of the institutional racism that permeates our society. Malcolm nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I know, but what can we do? They want me to be silent. The media is already having a field day with the scandal, framing it as mere entertainment. We need something more substantial than just protests. Felipe, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. We can file a lawsuit against the restaurant and the police officers. If we are successful, this could open doors for a broader discussion about the discrimination you faced. We can't let this go unaddressed. And what if they try to discredit you? They're already doing that in the press, Carla interjected, concerned. We need evidence, something that clearly shows the misconduct of the police officers. Malcolm took a deep breath, his mind swirling with possibilities. I need to speak to the community. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has suffered the same type of discrimination. If they come together, maybe we can make a difference. In the following days, mobilization began. Malcolm, accompanied by Carla and Felipe, held a series of meetings with community leaders in Brixton. He sat at simple wooden tables in community centers, surrounded by familiar faces, all of whom had similar stories to share. We need to unite, he said, his voice strong and full of conviction. What happened to me can happen to any of you. It's time to raise our voices against this injustice. The meeting sparked a wave of support. Posters began appearing in the windows of homes, and social media was flooded with messages of solidarity. Meanwhile, James, the police officer who had confronted Malcolm, felt increasingly tormented. He watched the news on television, witnessing the fallout from the incident, and his heart weighed heavy with guilt. He couldn't understand how he had allowed himself to be swayed by such deep-rooted prejudices. In a moment of desperation, he decided to seek out Daniel, his partner, one of the few he believed could understand his internal struggle. Daniel, did you see what's happening? That was outrage. I don't know what to think. I always believed I was doing my job, but now, James began, his voice trembling. James, you need to understand that police culture needs to change. This isn't just about you or Malcolm. It's a system that needs reform, Daniel replied, his expression serious. You need to look inside yourself and confront what you really believe. Meanwhile, the Brixton community was mobilizing. On a Friday night, an event was organized featuring speeches, music, and dancing. Malcolm felt emotional seeing so many people united. This is just the beginning, he said into the microphone, looking out at the crowd. The fight for justice is a collective struggle. We're not just fighting for me, but for everyone who has ever been silenced. The applause and cheers of support were deafening. Sophie, the restaurant manager, was among the crowd, watching everything with a mix of admiration and guilt. She knew she needed to take a stand. I can't remain silent. I'm part of the problem, she murmured to herself as she prepared to make a public statement. With the community's support, Malcolm and his lawyers began gathering evidence. Witnesses were called to share their stories, and the once silenced voices began to echo. "We need you to speak about what you saw that day," Carla said to a witness, her voice gentle but determined. "I was there, and I saw everything. What they did to you was inhumane," the woman replied, tears in her eyes. "I'm willing to testify." The fight for justice had begun, and Malcolm felt that despite the adversity, a new hope was emerging. He was no longer alone. The community was by his side, and together they were seeking a more just future. Daniel Harris watched his partner, James Cooper, with a mix of concern and confusion. They were in a break room at the precinct, surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee and the distant sound of laughter from colleagues who had yet to grasp the gravity of what had happened. The incident at the restaurant had shaken the city, and more importantly, had sown an uncomfortable doubt in Daniel's mind. "James, do you really think what we did was right?" Daniel began, his voice low, almost as if fearing the answer. He didn't want to challenge James, but the pressure was becoming unbearable. That man was a judge, he had every right to be there. James turned, his face tense. He didn't look like the type who frequents that place. "Look, Daniel, you saw the faces of the people. They were uncomfortable. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Daniel shot back, raising his voice involuntarily. "Your job was to protect him, not to throw him out. What are we doing here if we're not protecting the people who need us?" James took a step back as if Daniel's outburst had hit him hard. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the doubt. "I'm not saying it was easy, but we have to maintain order. Sometimes that means doing things that aren't popular." "Maintain order or maintain the status quo," Daniel countered, now more resolute. "We're perpetuating a system that doesn't serve everyone. Look at us. We're on the side of authority, but what if that authority is wrong?" James stared out the window, where sunlight filtered through the clouds. He knew Daniel was right, but he wasn't ready to accept it. I don't know, man. I'm confused. What do you want me to do? Apologize? Become an activist? That's not for us." The tension in the room escalated, and Daniel felt the weight of unspoken words. "Maybe not, but what if there's a way to change it? What if we can make a difference? Look at Malcolm. He's fighting against a system that humiliated him. And why? Because he cares." James closed his eyes, a mix of anger and pain in his gaze. What if he loses? What if this just makes things worse? "If he loses, that doesn't mean his fight isn't worth it," Daniel insisted, his voice now softer. "Sometimes change begins with the courage to acknowledge our mistakes. We need to do this together." At that moment, Sophie Mitchell was watching coverage of the incident on television at home, her heart heavy. The image of Malcolm being thrown out of the restaurant wouldn't leave her mind. She had been there, had seen everything unfold, and did nothing. Guilt washed over her, and she didn't know how to cope with it. "I should have intervened," she murmured to herself, her hands trembling. "Why didn't I do anything?" Seeing the backlash on social media, where Malcolm was becoming a symbol of the fight against racism, Sophie felt the pressure to take a stand. She heard the voices of friends and acquaintances discussing the incident, with most remaining silent for fear of repercussions. She picked up her phone and started typing a post, but hesitated. "What if I get attacked? What if people turn against me?" she thought, distressed. But looking at Malcolm's image, she realized her own struggle was insignificant compared to his. With renewed determination, Sophie stood up, took a deep breath, and decided it was time to speak out. "I can't stay silent," she told herself as she prepared for the press conference that had been called. "His fight is our fight." The next day, as cameras surrounded her, Sophie stood in front of reporters, her heart racing. "I'm here to support Malcolm Richardson," she began, her voice steady. What happened at the restaurant was not just a mistake. It was a reflection of a society still grappling with institutional racism. It is our duty to recognize and combat this. Sophie's words echoed in the room, and Daniel, watching from home, felt a wave of hope. He knew that change wouldn't come easy, but perhaps, just perhaps, they could be part of something bigger. Malcolm's struggle had awakened something within them, and now it was time for everyone to unite. The tension in the air was palpable as Malcolm prepared for the start of the trial. Sitting at his desk, surrounded by piles of documents and reports, he tried to concentrate, but anxiety pulsed in his chest. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his lawyer informing him about the media coverage. Cameras were set up and reporters were crowding at the courthouse entrance, ready to capture every movement. "Malcolm, you'd better prepare yourself. The pressure is going to be intense," his lawyer said, his voice grave and concerned. "Are you ready for this?" "I don't have a choice," Malcolm replied, looking out the window. The world outside seemed distant, as if he were in a bubble. I need to do this, for me, for my family, and for everyone who has suffered because of racism. Meanwhile, across town, James Cooper sat in his car, his hand trembling on the steering wheel. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw the face of Daniel Harris, his partner, reflecting a mixture of worry and reproach. "Are you okay, James?" Daniel asked, his voice low and cautious. James sighed, his stomach twisting. "I don't know, man. All of this is weighing on me. What we did, it was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but in the moment, I didn't think. And now, I'm here, about to testify against a man who just wanted to have dinner." "You need to be honest, James. If you don't do it now, when will you?" Daniel stared at James, his eyes fixed and intense. "The culture we have in the police needs to change, and you know that. If you step back now, you'll stay in that bubble, and nothing will change." James shook his head, an internal conflict forming. "I don't want to be the villain, but at the same time I can't ignore what I did. I just don't know if I can face myself." Back in the courtroom, Malcolm felt the weight of the gazes on him. The room was full, and the whispers from the crowd felt like a wave engulfing him. He took a deep breath and prepared for what lay ahead. When the judge entered, the room fell silent instantly. Malcolm stood up and began to present his evidence, recounting the humiliation he endured and the impact the incident had on his life. "This isn't just about me," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "It's about everyone who has felt invisible or dehumanized because of the color of their skin. Institutional racism cannot be tolerated anywhere, especially in a space that should symbolize justice." The eyes of the public were fixed on him, and he could feel the empathy growing. However, the tension in his chest increased as expectations mounted. He knew he needed to convince not only the judge, but also society. In the next hearing, James was called to testify. He stood, his body tense as he walked to the witness stand. The room was silent, all eyes on him. When questioned about the incident, his voice faltered. I wasn't thinking clearly at that moment," he began, hesitantly. I just followed procedures." Malcolm watched him closely, noticing James's internal struggle. "Do you really believe that what you did was right? That the way you approached a black judge was appropriate?" Malcolm questioned, his voice penetrating, seeking the truth. James looked around, the pressure enveloping him. "No, I don't know. I should have acted differently." He hesitated, confusion evident on his face. "I guess I let myself be guided by what I was always taught, that people like him don't belong in places like that." Daniel, who was in the room, could no longer remain silent. He stood up, his expression determined, and declared, "This is what needs to change. We can't keep allowing this mentality to prevail. We need to be better. I can't stay silent while this happens." Daniel's words echoed in the room, and the tension reached a new peak. James looked at him, surprised and ashamed. The internal struggle intensified as the weight of reality began to crumble the walls he had built around himself. The courtroom was in turmoil, and Malcolm realized that the fight wasn't just his, but of everyone willing to change. The truth was emerging, and even in the face of adversity, hope began to shine in the darkness of that battle. The courtroom was in a tense silence, almost palpable. Malcolm Richardson, with a firm and determined demeanor, was about to present his testimony. He took a deep breath, recalling every insult, every look of disdain he faced since the incident at the restaurant. The room was filled with journalists, supporters, and public figures who somehow felt touched by Malcolm's struggle, and also by the fight against institutionalized racism that permeated society. He stood, his imposing presence drawing everyone's attention. "Your Honor," Malcolm began, his voice resonating with authority. "Today, I am not here just to recount a particular incident. I am here to expose a system that perpetuates discrimination and injustice. What happened to me at the restaurant is not an isolated case. It is a reflection of a culture that refuses to acknowledge its prejudice." The jurors' eyes were fixed on him, some reflecting on their own experiences and biases as they listened to his words. Malcolm continued, "When I entered that restaurant, I was not treated as a judge, but as an intruder. Every glance, every whisper, every gesture reminded me that for some, the color of my skin speaks louder than the title I carry. I am a federal judge, but in that moment I was nothing more than a black man in a place that did not accept me." The defense attorney, a tall and robust man, stood up. "Mr. Richardson, what you are saying is very serious. What leads you to believe that the treatment you received was due to racism and not a misunderstanding or an isolated situation? Malcolm did not hesitate. What happened to me was not a misunderstanding. It was a clear demonstration of prejudice. And this was not just about me. It was about everyone who, like me, faces discrimination daily. What I want you to understand, Mr. Attorney, is that this is not just a case of a judge being removed from a restaurant. It's about a system that fails to see the humanity in individuals who don't fit its narrow vision of how things should be. The room was enveloped in a reverent silence. Malcolm felt the energy shift. He was connecting with the people, prompting them to reflect. But then, it was James Cooper's turn, the officer who had expelled him, to take the stand. James ascended to the podium, his expression that of a man overwhelmed by circumstances. He cast a nervous glance at Malcolm before turning to the judge. "James, can you describe what happened that day?" asked the defense attorney, trying to establish a favorable narrative. I just did my job," James began, his voice shaky. "When the manager called me, I thought he was causing trouble. I had never seen a judge in that restaurant before." Malcolm couldn't help but smirk ironically. Never seen a black judge, perhaps? He had no intention of letting the opportunity slip away. James hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "No, that's not what I meant. I didn't expect to see someone like you there." "Someone like me?" Malcolm echoed, his voice rising. "You mean my skin color? You weren't surprised to see a judge, but rather a black man. That's racism, James, and you need to confront it. What were you thinking when you expelled me?" The tension in the room escalated, and James seemed to be battling a whirlwind of emotions. He looked at the judge and in a moment of weakness admitted, I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't know who you were. "And that's the issue," Malcolm said, his voice softening, almost paternal. "You didn't bother to find out. You presumed, and your assumptions cost a man his dignity when he did nothing wrong." It was then that Daniel, James's partner, stood up. He knew he was about to tread on dangerous ground, but the truth weighed heavily on his conscience. "I need to say something," he began, looking at the audience before turning to James. "What you did was wrong, and it's not just that. The culture within the police needs to change. We can't continue to protect this kind of behavior." James looked at Daniel, his face pale with shock. "Daniel, don't do this," he pleaded, but Daniel's resolve was unwavering. He turned to the judge and continued, "I can't stay silent anymore. This needs to change." The courtroom was in a frenzy. Malcolm knew he was witnessing not just the fight for justice, but also an internal battle that could lead to transformation. Emotions were running high, and he could feel that somehow, something was shifting, not just for him, but for everyone present. The courtroom fell into silence, the tension hanging in the air like a dense cloud. Standing tall, Malcolm felt his heart race as he awaited the verdict. The gazes of those present were fixed on the judge, and the anticipation was palpable. He knew the decision to be announced had the power to change not only his life, but also the course of the fight against institutional racism. When the judge finally entered the room, a murmur swept through the crowd. The atmosphere was charged with nervousness and hope. Malcolm exchanged glances with Sophie, who sat in the front row, her face reflecting a mix of anxiety and determination. He remembered the support she had shown him, and it gave him strength. "In the name of the law, I declare that..." The judge's voice resonated, but the words faded into a distant echo as Malcolm focused on his own breathing. The moment seemed to stretch, and each second felt like an eternity. Finally, the words he had longed to hear came. "The court finds the involved officers guilty of abuse of authority and racism." A cheer erupted among Malcolm's supporters, and tears of relief streamed down Sophie's face. Social media and news channels exploded with reactions. "This is a huge step, Malcolm. You did it," Sophie exclaimed as she rushed to him after the hearing, her heart overflowing with joy. Malcolm embraced her, feeling the emotion vibrate between them. "This isn't just mine. It's all of ours. This fight belongs to everyone who has faced injustice," he replied, his voice strong yet filled with emotion. As the news spread, reactions ranged from celebration to outrage. Social media was ablaze, and the verdict sparked heated debates. In a television studio, a commentator stated, "This is a turning point. People are starting to realize they can no longer act with impunity." However, not everyone was pleased with the outcome. James, the officer who had been one of the key players in the incident, sat at home surrounded by a heavy atmosphere. He turned on the TV and watched the news, his stomach twisting with every word he heard. "This verdict reflects the society we are building," another commentator said. "A call for all of us to look inward and rethink our biases." "This isn't the society I want," James shouted, standing up abruptly. He felt lost, filled with anger and confusion. The truth was that even with the support of his colleagues, he couldn't shake the seed of doubt that had been planted in his mind. Meanwhile, at the restaurant where it all began, Sophie faced the consequences of her decision to publicly stand alongside Malcolm. Customers began reacting, some praising her courage while others criticized her harshly. "You betrayed our class," one customer said in a cutting tone. "That judge was an intruder and you defend him?" Sophie took a deep breath, gripping the manager's hand. "I can't stay silent. What happened that day was wrong, and I can't close my eyes to it even if it means losing customers," she responded, her voice strong and resolute. "If I don't do something, then who will?" Malcolm's struggle became a symbol, inspiring many to unite against discrimination. He began receiving invitations for speeches and debates, and his story started to echo nationwide. In a press conference, he stated, "This victory is just the beginning. We need to keep fighting, we need to talk, listen, and above all, change." Journalists surrounded him, firing questions about the next steps. "What do you hope to see happen now?" a reporter asked. Malcolm took a deep breath before responding. "I hope to see more people standing up against injustice. I hope we can all continue to work together to create a better future." Meanwhile, James, isolated in his home, began to reflect on his choices and actions. He realized that change would not happen without a deep examination of his own beliefs. The voices in his head screamed, as the echo of the court's decision still reverberated in his mind. Malcolm's struggle had become a beacon of light, and he knew he had to decide whether he would be part of the change or continue to be an agent of oppression. James Cooper walked the streets of Brixton, his heart heavy with the weight of the decisions he had made. The city, once merely a workplace, had now become a labyrinth of conflicting emotions. He no longer felt part of what he had always believed to be the natural order of things. The faces that passed him seemed to carry a look of reproach, as if they knew of his failure, of his inability to act with integrity at a critical moment. As he entered a cafe, he spotted a group of young people animatedly discussing Malcolm's trial. The mention of the judge's name made his stomach churn. He ordered a coffee and sat in a corner, trying to hide from the echoing voices around him. "Did you see what happened in court? Malcolm is a hero," a young woman exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with passion. "Finally, someone is facing the truth." James felt increasingly isolated. He knew he had failed not only Malcolm but the very essence of what a police officer should be. It was time to confront reality and seek help. He pulled out his phone and, with a hesitant gesture, dialed the number of a therapist he had found in an ad. After some nervous taps, a voice answered on the other end. "Hello, this is Dr. Ellen. How can I help you?" "Hi, I'm James. I need help," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm confused about everything. What happened, what I did, it's consuming me." "James, you've taken the first step by seeking help. Let's work through this together. How about we schedule a session?" "Yes, please. I need to understand what happened and how I can change," he replied, feeling a small sense of relief as he shared his burden. Meanwhile, Malcolm was at home preparing for a talk at a local school. He looked at himself in the mirror, a determined expression reflected on his face. For him, the fight against institutional racism was not just a personal issue. It was a responsibility he now carried with pride. As he headed to the event, he felt a mix of nervousness and hope. In the auditorium, he was greeted with warm applause. Taking the microphone, he took a deep breath and began, "Thank you all for being here. Today I'm not just speaking as a judge, but as a man who believes change is possible. We as a society need to look inward and confront our biases." A student raised their hand and asked, "But doctor, what can we do if injustice seems so overwhelming?" "Each of you has the power to make a difference," Malcolm replied, his gaze intensifying. "Whether through education, activism, or simply challenging what you see around you. Change begins with dialogue. I am here today because I chose to raise my voice, and I want you to do the same." The auditorium fell silent, absorbing his words. He continued, "We cannot be afraid to take a stand. Empathy is the key to understanding. We need to listen to each other, to comprehend the experiences that shape us. This is the foundation of justice." After the talk, Malcolm was surrounded by students eager to take photos and ask questions. He felt empowered seeing the passion in their eyes. It was a sign that his struggle was not in vain. Meanwhile, Daniel Harris, who had connected with Malcolm and Sophie, was attending a community meeting. He stood up to speak, his voice firm. "We need more than words. We must unite to demand changes in the structures that perpetuate racism. I am ready to be part of this fight." The room erupted in applause, and Daniel felt invigorated. He had found his voice just like James and Malcolm. Together they represented a new hope, an emerging change that was beginning to spread through the community. These moments of reflection and action were shaping a different future. Malcolm, James, and Daniel were on parallel paths, each dealing with their personal crises, but all driven by the same quest for justice and redemption. Malcolm was nervous, but also determined. The press conference was set for 3 p.m. and the court's conference room was filled with journalists, cameras, and reporters. He prepared for the moment that could change everything. With a steady gaze, he took a deep breath as he approached the microphone, feeling the weight of expectation on his shoulders. The room silenced as he began to speak. "Today, we are not just here to discuss what happened to me, but to address a problem that affects us all: institutional racism." Malcolm's voice resonated in the room, and he saw some reporters nodding in agreement. "I want you to know that I have a recording from the day I was expelled from that restaurant. A recording that shows not only the misconduct of the police officers, but also the culture of prejudice that is ingrained in many institutions." Immediate reactions followed. Murmurs of surprise and disbelief spread through the room, and reporters began asking questions all at once. "Can you show us the recording, Malcolm?" a reporter from a local network asked. "Yes, but not now. I want everyone to understand the importance of what's at stake before we watch it together," Malcolm responded, holding the gaze of the crowd. "This recording is not just about me. It's about everyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of prejudice." Meanwhile, in a corner of the room, James Cooper watched the event, his heart racing uncontrollably. He was there not as a police officer, but as a man beginning to realize the impact of his actions. The feeling of guilt consumed him, and he wondered if he should stand up and confront Malcolm. But at the same time, he knew that the truth would be his greatest enemy. "Malcolm, do you really believe that this recording will change anything?" James asked, his voice low but audible as he stood up. All eyes quickly turned to him. "Do you think this will solve the problem? What will you do if things get worse?" Malcolm looked at James, his gaze mixed with perplexity and compassion. "James, you need to understand that change doesn't come without pain. If you don't confront reality, nothing will change. The truth may be uncomfortable, but it is essential. You have no idea what it's like to be a police officer. The pressure, the expectations. We are trained to act in a certain way," James retorted, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I don't want to be that person anymore." "Then do the right thing. Witness the truth. If you're struggling with who you are, this might be your chance for redemption," Malcolm responded, his voice firm yet full of empathy. The press conference continued, but Malcolm's words echoed in James's mind. He sat back down, the weight of shame and doubt accumulating inside him. Meanwhile, Malcolm went on to discuss the recording, detailing the racist comments made by the police officers who had kicked him out of the restaurant. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. Malcolm decided it was time to show the recording. He activated the projector and the room fell into utter silence. The footage displayed the moment he was confronted, the voices of James and Daniel echoing, revealing their prejudiced opinions. "As you can see, this is not just an issue of individual behavior, but of a culture that needs to be dismantled," Malcolm said after the screening. "Change cannot happen unless we recognize the problems that are right in front of us." By the end of the press conference, the fallout was immediate. Social media exploded with reactions, and the pressure on the police department intensified. However, for James, the weight of the gravity of what he had done weighed more heavily than ever. In a moment of desperation, he decided to step away from the police force and seek help. He could no longer hide behind his uniform. Meanwhile, Malcolm was hailed as a hero, but he knew that the fight was far from over. That very night, he received an award for his courage and leadership at a community event. Surrounded by supporters who honored him, Sophie and Daniel were by his side, now active advocates for justice ready to continue the fight. James, on the other hand, watched from a distance, consumed by guilt and the loss of everything he once held dear. He understood that transformation was necessary, not just for himself but for everyone around him. And as he reflected on his journey, he realized that the cost of prejudice was far too high, but the need for change was even more urgent.